Welcome to What Drives You with your host, Mike Gorday, human solution consultant from Seattle, Washington, providing his insights and expertise. Now it's time to sit back and buckle up for the show that drives the asking question, what drives you? And now your host, Mike Gorday.
Welcome to this week's episode of What Drives You, the show about why we do the things we do. I'm Mike, your host, a human solutions consultant here in Seattle, Washington. Today, we're going to be talking about a few things that I've been reading in the news. And the first one is going to be talking about the anxiety that people are experiencing on going back to the workplace. And then afterwards, we're going to revisit part of the conversation we had a couple weeks ago about some of this AI stuff and getting jobs. And then we're going to answer the question of the day. So hang out. We'll be right back. So I was recently reading an article about the reports that people are experiencing anxiety about returning back to work. And to me, that doesn't, there's no surprise there. There's no surprise there at all. But the way this article was written was that this is like this huge thing. But it's not a huge thing. Let's talk about why this would be a problem and why this would be normal. I mean, here we go. We have been spending this time over the past year and a half almost. We're heading into the year 2 of the COVID nightmare. And this thing has disrupted our entire lives. It has disrupted almost everything. There's been an increase in suicide, an increase in divorce. There's all this stuff going on, violence, protesting. We can say that it's not necessarily that COVID is the reason for it, but it sets the stage for a lot of the stuff that we're seeing. And this is what prompted me to start this podcast, because, well, there's a lot of people that's out there that's hurting and we don't know what to do with ourselves. Regardless of what you believe COVID is, regardless of what you believe it should be or shouldn't be, regardless of whether or not you believe it's deadly or not, or even non-existent. The fact is that this is a global disaster. The experience of COVID has created a global disaster. And we have all had to adapt. Some of us are adapting fine, some of us are not. And that's the way human nature is. We have trouble with change. We don't like it. And when we have to do it, it comes with a lot of struggle. And there's a lot of well-meaning stuff out there about going with the flow and things like that. But that's not as realistic as we would like it to be. I mean, there's a lot of healthy benefits to just responding and going with the flow. Okay? I mean, that's just the way it is, but we can't live like that. We can't always go with the flow, because if we always go with the flow, then we are just drifting through life. However, we have adapted to this new lifestyle. And part of that is a lot of us are working from home. A lot of us are working in environments where we're not near people. And so we're seeing a lot of stuff going on. Now, back to the article. The article is talking about how many people are experiencing anxiety about us going back to normal. Okay. And this may seem like a weird thing because we all want normal. We all want to go back to what things were, but that's not necessarily true. A lot of people don't like the old normal because of things like social anxiety, because of things like that. So we have to consider that first. You know, um, I mentioned it just a moment ago, human beings hate change. We don't, it's funny that adaptation is a survival mechanism, but yet we hate it and we resist it. And if you study Darwin's theories or anything like that, we know that there is this idea that adaptation, if you fail to adapt, you die. You are exiting the gene pool. Therefore, your DNA sequence no longer can adapt to the situation. That's sort of the idea, right? In a very, very broad stroke nutshell. Let me just put it that way, because I'm not going to extol all these theories. But it's one of the interesting paradoxes about the human being or animal nature as well, that change is constant in our lives, and adaptation is a constant survival mechanism, yet we can't stand it. We hate it. We don't want things to change, because that means we have to utilize our skills and our energy when the one thing we want to do is conserve that energy just so we can survive. So it's quite an interesting conundrum. But that's one of the reasons why this is happening on a larger scale than what people thought, is that going back to the office represents another change, regardless of the fact that we have had that in the past, and that's what we called normal. We have been experiencing this abnormal situation so long that it is becoming normal, and therefore a change coming back up is representing some form of anxiety. Okay, that's one point. The second point is that there's a group of people that don't like normal in the first place, and the fact that they want to go back into the office means that they will have to go back to the things they hate. Like, for instance, me, that would mean I would have to travel 10 miles to get to my office, and it's going to take me a freaking hour, an hour and a half to get there. Okay. Traffic, the commute. All right. That's a very stressful event that I have to face Monday through Friday every morning, and Monday through Friday every afternoon is two very stressful situations that I don't want to do. Now, when I get to the office, hey, everything's fine. I enjoy being around coworkers. I enjoy my workspace, all this other stuff. But those two bookend stressors I don't like. And that's one of the things that people are talking about. This disrupts my day. And it's very nice that I can get up, walk a few feet. That's my commute in the morning, and then go to work. There's you can see the difference right there. Uh, so facing the normal doesn't necessarily mean we like normal. The other thing is that regardless again of what you might think, the consensus is that we've come to at least be compliant with is this idea of social distancing and being very careful. The problem with this disaster is that it has created phobic responses that are necessary, right? However, I don't know if you've experienced this, but this happens all the time where I have to go to the grocery store, or I'm walking and somebody's walking towards me, and I am hyper aware of that person getting closer. So what has happened over the past year and a half is that this disaster mechanism has created a need and a desire for more personal space. Why? Because we have come to understand that there is a threatening area under 6 feet. If you get within 6 feet of somebody, you are potentially going to die. And that's the way this is interpreting. And I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying, but that's what our brain does. Our brain says, okay, if these people get within 6 feet of us, we could potentially die. And it doesn't mean that you are. It just means that and this is the issue with our limbic system, our survival brain, is that it's very black and white about things, and we influence it by how we program it. So when the 6 foot rule first came out, everybody is trying hard not to do that. Everybody's wondering what's going on. Then there's more fear involved, so everybody starts moving away. Then there's fights about people who are getting in close, and see how this thing just interrupts our lives. So there's that to consider. We're going back into these confined spaces where we've been told for the past year and some months that it's bad to do so, that it's dangerous to do so. And so our limbic system understands this because we've programmed it to understand this. And so there's going to be a lot of anxiety about that, despite the fact that vaccines have been rolled out and people are getting vaccinated, despite the fact that things seem to be moving back to a normal situation. We're still going to have those fears. This thing has also affected the way that we relate to human beings in general. It's created a very different way of experiencing a human. And part of that is that because we have been existing on video platforms and things, we have started to adapt to that platform. We have started to adapt to the behaviors that go on in that platform. So when we get around people, we're being refreshed on the old way of doing things, which is creating a little bit of dissonance or cognitive dissonance with how we have to deal with things. Again, there's partly belief, but there's also just that natural adaptation. So we've got several things going on here that is creating some reluctance to go back into the workplace, go back into the office, get back to normal. And as much as it seems like this is an abnormal thing, this is a completely normal thing. So I just wanted to bring that up because the article was sort of set up to be like, why would anybody be anxious about returning to work? Why would anybody be worried about going back to normal? And there are just so many reasons why this is normal. So just remember that. Take it again. Part of the whole goal of this podcast, the way I've talked about this, is to kind of step back and think a minute and see what's going on. And that's going to bleed into our next segment here when I talk a little bit about these AI things. But just understand that here's another point. This is why I call future casting. Our brains are predicting machines, so it's always trying to look for threats. Mostly, it doesn't really go well with anything else, and we have to consciously program it to feel pleasure in the future. But the brain is always looking for future threats, and I call this future casting because it's a lot of times we will create this future based on the information that we're getting right now and the way we're feeling right now. This happens in relationships. It happens a lot. So let's take a relationship, for instance. We get into these places where we feel stagnant or we feel like nothing's going to change. And we future cast that. We say, okay, this is just going to get worse. This is going to continue to happen. This isn't what I want. and then I create a future based on those feelings of negativity, and say, okay, well, okay, then I need to get out of this relationship. Okay, we do that all the time with other things too. But uh, in a sense, we cast that those feelings forward in the future and catch this big old nasty fish that is inedible. So that's what we're doing too. We are future casting. We are sitting here right now thinking, okay, we've been told over the last year and a half that oh, this is going to be a few weeks, this is going to be a few months, this is going to be, we're going to get back to work soon, things are going to pick up. And then we keep getting the news, no, we got to push this out, no, we got to. So we're future casting this sort of event that's like, okay, I want this normal, but it's not going to happen because everything's bad, everything sucks, we're going to have to do this. So we're future casting that. So all this kind of just goes into this big tapestry of suck, which creates anxiety. Again, this is normal. Just take a step back, just kind of look at it for what it is. And I don't know what your personal views are. I don't know what your life is like. I don't know what that's what makes us unique is our experiences. Otherwise, we're very remarkably the same, which is, I've talked about this before. It's interesting how the same we are, but that's not what we focus on. We always focus on the differences. You're going to deal with this how you deal with it. One of the strategies that I use is just kind of taking a step back and learning what's going on. So that's it for that. I just wanted to talk about that. We'll be right back. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of this AI stuff that I talked about a couple of weeks ago. That I had some conversation with somebody who was asking me about the facial scanning stuff that companies are starting to use to get a feel for them. And we'll talk about that right when we come back. So stick around. Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about how online personality tests that corporations are using for hiring process can be discriminatory. And I talked a little bit about some of these other things that companies are trying to use in order to recruit people. And they're saying that they're non-biased, and that's really kind of a lie. They may not be non-biased in certain ways, but they're biased in other ways. One of the ones that I was talking about is something called someone has coined them a sentiment analysis tool. And what it is these computer programs that you sit in front of a camera like I'm doing right now, and the computer measures everything going on in your face and your body position. And it creates profiles based on what you're doing. And the way these things are being used is to find out if you are confident in yourself, if you're a good fit for the job or whatever. And what I talked about here is the problem is that we do a lot of things that, first off, the computer, like I said, the computer can pick up things much better than the human eye can. That's a plus. The negative is that it interprets those movements based on how it's programmed to do so. And I mentioned a lot about eyebrows, and one of the reasons why I mentioned this is because I was looking into one of these facial analysis tools as part of the radio show that I do about technology, and was noticing that the computer, or the the results generating part of that algorithm would track eyebrow raises and label that as surprise. And the problem I have with that is that probably 98% of those eyebrow raises were not indicative of surprise, because surprise is contextual. As we're talking, and if you're watching the video of this, you're going to see it, is that we have a lot of facial movements that don't represent emotional responses, or necessarily they don't represent a feeling. What they are is accentuating points, or using these features to show, well, it's communicative. It's called preverbals or subverbals. No, hang on. I am misusing my words. Anyway, for instance, a lot of people will knit their brows while they're talking. And if you do a little research on facial expressions, you're going to see that anger is a brow knitting event. And what happens is that when you don't understand what the actual thing is, you start to generalize it. So what happens is you learn that knitting the brows is a sign of anger. And so when people knit their brows, you automatically think, oh, that's anger, when that's not necessarily what's going on, because these things happen in conjunction with different eye movements or different muscle movements, as well as context. And that's one of the important things I want to talk about, is context. And this is the problem with these AI scanners, is they can't scan context. They don't understand context. That's one of the things that humans are always going to be able to do, is understand. Well, they're going to be able to understand context better, but one of the problems that we do also is that we discount context. We don't pay attention to context. Because when we consider context, we have to step outside of the event and think about it consciously. And as I've talked about before, that's really not how our brain is designed. Our brain is designed to try and figure out what's going on in an instant, so that we can survive the event if it's threatening. If it's not threatening, then we get comfortable. So understanding context is something that we have to do outside of that. We have to train ourselves to do that. So here's the thing with these computer programs that identify emotional responses based on muscle movements, which in and of itself is not a good idea. And it's not to say that these things can't identify them. It just means that there's a lot of misidentification of extraneous or otherwise non-emotional movements. And like I said, brow knitting to be one of them. Like this particular one that I watched, every time the eyebrows lifted to accentuate a point, the computer program identified that as surprise. And anybody looking at that would start to form an impression of that person based on the amount of surprise events that the computer tracked. See, this is the problem with this shit, right? So if the computer says this person was surprised 70 times during this 15-minute speech, and it spits out this information, and you're looking at this as a person, you're going to go, why were they surprised? That must mean they don't know a whole lot about this stuff. That must mean that they don't have the skills to do this. You see how that's a very quick and natural progression to interpreting that event, 76 surprises. Okay, so here's the problem that I was suggesting earlier. 98% of those surprises were non-contextual. They were simply accentuating what the person was saying. And when I say contextual here, here's what I mean. in order for you to be surprised, something has to happen that surprises you. Now, I'm not saying that we can't surprise ourselves, because we can, but normally it would be like I ask you a question you weren't expecting. So if I'm asking you, if I'm sitting there and we're doing an interview for a job and I say, tell me about your last job, right? You're gonna have a response for that. And if you go online, you can find 50 common questions to interview, to prep yourself for an interview, right? And if you've done that, you're not going to be surprised when those questions come up. But if I say something that's completely outside of what you were expecting, like how many golf balls can fill up a 747, which is an actual question, uh, I would expect you to be surprised, because you were engaged in a process that was routine and practiced for, and I threw in a hand grenade and completely blew you up. So I would expect to see your eyebrows go up, regardless of how surprised you were. It could be a very quick one, or it could be a more lengthy, but I would expect your eyebrows to go up, your mouth to drop down, and you would show me that surprise. Now the computer doesn't understand that. All it does is say, okay, anytime the frontalis muscles here pull up the eyebrows, that's surprise. And that's the problem with these kind of systems, is that it relies on the algorithm that is programmed by a human being that doesn't understand the nuances of these particular things, and it cannot be programmed for context. So I ask you a question that you're not expecting. You get surprised. As a human being, if I'm aware of it, if I'm aware that this is going to cause surprise and I see you respond, I can understand, okay, that's surprise. Are you tracking with me? Does that make sense? One of the other pieces about, and this is important too on a personal level, and I don't know if you heard about Mark Bowden. He's one of these big giants in the body language world. He wrote a book called Truth and Lies: What People Are Really Thinking. And he's one of the first ones that I've read that talk about context. Now, context is everything that surrounds this particular point of view that influences it. And what he's talking about is let's say that and this is a big one in today's world, is that if you text your wife or your girlfriend or your husband or your boyfriend or whatever, and they don't text you back quickly, you start to fill in the gaps. You start to think they're cheating on me, they are angry at me, there's something wrong. Okay. What we don't consider is that their phone may be off, they may be in the bathroom, they may be in a meeting, they may be working. We don't think like that, because with the absence of information, we will put information in to complete the story, and that information is almost always negative, because that's our survival brain at work. And one of the great things about this book is that he talks about considering the context. And again, it's a conscious process that we have to pull ourselves out of what we're thinking and use our rational brain to sort of consider these options. Computer program can't do that. Another piece of this is that context relies on memory, right? When we are talking with people, when we are conversing with other people, we are constantly moving back and forth in our memory about what we've talked about, what we're going to talk about, the possibly the words that person has used, and things like that. And we're using those pieces of memory to carry on the conversation. Computer can't do that. Okay, that requires a mental gymnastic of memory response that frankly I don't know that anybody could program a computer to do. So it's not only taking this memory stuff that we're talking about, right? But it's also considering things outside the realm of the conversation or the event, right? So if I again, back to that idea, if I'm sitting here saying, how many golf balls can fill up a 747. You weren't expecting that. I got a surprise response. As a person that understands what's going on, I can go, okay, they've never heard that question before. That's pretty cool. Let's see what they do with that. A computer is just going to go, oh, they were surprised by that. And then it's going to spit out the response. They were surprised by this question. And it does. And because we are who we are, we're not going to look at the question that was asked. We're probably going to look at the response or the result that the computer gives us. And we're not taking into account that there are X things outside this realm, which a computer is not going to do. And I'll be honest, people aren't going to do that as much either, because again, considering context is not a survival mechanism. Our survival mechanisms want things right now, right quick, as quickly as possible to make a decision. And this is one of the big human issues that we have is, are we super impulsive? If we're super impulsive, we tend to rely on our survival responses more than our thinking brain. If we are overthinking things, we are relying more on our conscious brain, which often creates anxiety, which often creates stagnation, which often creates not a lot of movement. So being human is this big dance of when do we follow the survival response? When do we try to think our way through a problem? So once more, I've shown you that things that seem simple on the surface, they're not simple at all when we start digging in deep. So the big thing I wanted to talk about today was how these computer programs don't and cannot take into context, and how when we start relying on that computer to do the work for us, we rob that person of any other contextual events that we need to judge them, because we are relying on the computer to do the work for us. And that's what creates the problems. That's what creates the issues that these types of systems use, and they're being touted as non-biased. And that's what I have a problem with. I have a problem with thinking that we're going to solve a problem using technology when we don't understand everything either, because we can only build something according to the person that's programming that computer. And if that person is not an expert on, say, what a surprise is or isn't, or what anger flashes is or is not, they're not going to be able to program that. And I'm not even sure if they can program it in the first place. I'm still out to lunch on some of that, because when I'm looking at some of these programs, I see a lot of things the computer doesn't. And the computer is saying things are happening that aren't there. So if you want to talk a little bit more about that, hey, let me know. I really enjoy these types of conversations. We're going to come back with the question of the day. We'll be right back. Have you ever heard of it's like finding a needle in the haystack? Yeah, everybody's heard this. So I was walking the other day and I heard this in a commercial, and it just struck me. That's an interesting thing. We continue to use these things, and I hear people bitching about stuff, and I hear people and they'll change the actual cliche. And this is what this is a cliche. It's like finding a stack of needles or finding a needle in a stack of needles. It's about finding a blah, blah, blah. So these idioms, they create this sort of thing. And the question of the day is, why do we continue to use cliches? And on the surface, that's an easy answer, because it's easy, because everybody understands when I say it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Everybody knows that means it's hard. It's hard to find. So it's a message that I can use to relay a concept to somebody else that probably already knows that thing. That is probably the primary reason why we use that cliche over and over and over and over again, despite it's even outdated. I mean, if you look at the etymology of that and where this came from, or if you even think about it, why does that even make sense? Okay, you're looking for a needle in a haystack. All right, so you're looking for a little metal silver tool, a tiny metal silver tool in a pile of straw. And what we don't even understand that needles weren't always made out of metal. In fact, they used to be made out of bone or wood, which would make it a lot harder to see in a pile of hay. Right. So we extrapolate stuff as we move forward in time. We say, okay, it must be because it's not because of the needle's metal and shiny. It's probably because it's small and hay is big. And so we continue to drive that forward with our cultural context. Here's that word again, context. So that we continue to use this, and we do this all the time. You know why? But again, it's something easier to use but people like to try and create stuff around it by using the same terms. It's like finding a needle in a stack of needles. Okay. Well, that's certainly interesting. It's like finding a grain of sand on a beach. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Why don't we use it's like finding a diamond in a swimming pool. Okay. Well, you see, because we have to think about it. And that's the reason why we continually use these cliches. It's a natural, normal part of our existence, and that's where we get stereotyping from. It's a heuristic. It's a shortcut to a larger concept, which is really what our language is about. Our language is built around the idea that it's a shortcut to larger concepts. When I say you understand that I'm talking about you. Right? I don't have to generate a complete concept of who you are, what you do for a living, how you behave. All I have to say is you, and you can conceptualize yourself. It's the same thing with, trying to describe a sunset to somebody or love. What is love? Right? These are all heuristic ways of describing a concept that we feel, that we experience, but we don't really know how to describe. And that's why we continually hear needle in a haystack, because the primary reason is everybody probably knows what it is. Everybody's heard it once or twice. It's easy to remember. It's easy to understand the concept. So thanks for that. Have a great week. We'll be coming back next week. If you have any questions, please send them to me at mike@whatdrivesyou.net. It's really great when I can get questions about stuff that we've talked about, like the AI stuff. I know that that created some conversation about what goes into that. So that's why we talked a little bit more about it today. But ask questions. Why do you think people do the things they do? Or what are things that people do that cause you grief and what you want to know why? Let me know. Until then, have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.